Welcome to the Weird Medieval Guys podcast. Possibly the only podcast about weird medieval guys. I'm Olivia. I run the Weird Medieval Guys account on Twitter. And this is Aran, a hungry little Victorian urchin who sells matchsticks.
I was standing outside the beautiful shop window.
Yeah. You were admiring like a new pair of shoes.
A new pair, but in this case, the new pair of shoes is like 50,000 likes on Twitter, and I was like, I want to be famous, man.
Yeah, exactly.
And now we have a podcast. Welcome to the first ever episode of Weird Medieval Guys.
The feast is o'er. Now brimming wine in lordly cup is seen to shine before each eager guest. And silence fills the crowded hall, as deep as when the herald's call thrills in the loyal breast.
If you're listening to this, you might be familiar with the Weird Medieval Guys Twitter account.
I'm not. What's that?
For those of you who aren't, in April of 2022, I started a Twitter account. I had one goal, to share Weird Medieval Guys with the world. Now it's a bit more than a year later at the time of recording of this, and I'm Twitter famous.
That was the saddest admission of fame. You sound like...
I don't know how to, explain that I'm famous. Twitter fame is not funny. It's a burden.
Twitter fame is incredibly funny for exactly that
This
reason.
is why I don't tell people about this account.
The question that I have, and have always sort of had, is, why'd you do it? Why'd you make the account? What did you want to do?
I don't think that the urge to post can always be rationalized. It's can you explain why squirrels bury acorns in the ground? It's
Can you explain the Mona Lisa smile? Why does the muskrat guard his musk?
Exactly. It was about a year ago. I was finishing my degree at the University of Glasgow, and I think I was bored shitless. Not because I didn't have anything to do, because I had so much to do.
Or because the University of Glasgow is a bad university.
Because it's a bad university. And I think, it was kind of... I spent all of this time when, I couldn't justify leaving the house because I had things to do, so I was just sort of trying to put off doing things as much as possible. And I would just go through, I would just, browse the internet for ages. And I remember looking at all of these medieval manuscript websites, these places where libraries and museums have these scans that they upload where they scan every single page, and looking through them and thinking, this is absolutely insane, because these are all up here. I mean, these are all up here on the internet, thousands, tens of thousands of manuscripts. Someone's gone through and scanned every single page, and every single page of a lot of these manuscripts has these insane, incredible, hilarious drawings on them, and I don't think people know that this is something. I don't know if you are aware or were aware that this is a resource that exists.
I mean, I don't know where I thought you were getting them from. I think I kind of assumed that you worked for the British Library.
I wish.
And I was like, well, surely that's not. Okay, as somebody who did study history, it is astonishing how little of the stuff is digitized. Certainly the secondary literature. I had to climb to this the tallest tower of the most miserable corner of the university library to find this book by this long dead Bavarian man who was the only person who'd ever written about fucking the treatment of Catalan speakers in 18th century post-revolutionary France. And
it's strange because it seems like such a mainstream topic.
Well, in all other subjects, it's here's a fucking here's a paper about corn production in Belarus from 1922 to 1992, and that's all digitized and it's all available. It's just I can just pull this up. Whereas you have to go to these dusty fucking manuscripts that have not been opened since the late 90s. Haven't been opened since the Blair administration. and yeah, so it is kind of crazy that that resource exists. To me.
Yeah, exactly. And I think people feel this huge sense of distance between themselves and the medieval worlds. Like, it doesn't feel real, I think, to a lot of us.
Well, I just think it's crazy that all those medieval people uploaded all those documents to
Exactly.
the British Library
Put
website.
them on the internet for us. Thank you, medieval guys. There's this amazing episode of This American Life where Ira Glass takes the famous late medievalist Michael Camille to medieval times, the restaurant chain in America where you watch people joust.
I'm so disappointed that they turned out to be capital M, capital T medieval times. For a second, I thought you were saying that he had a TARDIS.
No, he didn't have a TARDIS. But so Ira Glass takes the medievalist Michael Camille to medieval times, and they're both like mic'd up the whole time, and Michael Camille is like live reacting to like, you know, the jousting and the people coming up to him and being like, "Hello, good sir, can I show you to your seat for some medieval Pepsi?" and it's an amazing episode.
Ye oldie Pepsi.
It's an amazing episode, but one of the things that I remember Michael Camille saying is that a lot of people are attracted to the medieval era because of some association they make between themselves and the era. So they think, oh, it was a time when people adhered to honorable values. And so for those people, it's a bit of a, oh, we need to go back thing. And
Return.
for other people, it's this kind of like, you know, mystical, magical time. And that's really appealing to them. And what Michael Camille said is the reason he, as a medievalist, is interested in this time period is actually that there's so little sometimes that we share in common with these people, and that makes it such an interesting sort of period of time to study. And so I'm not going to give an opinion on whether we're just like medieval people or we're nothing like medieval people, but I think that to me it felt really interesting sharing these sort of, you know, pieces of original documents and seeing people's reactions to them, seeing whether people had this response of, you know, oh, what the fuck is this? Why would someone draw this? Because, you know, you post something that's, you know, like a hybrid cat donkey taking a shit on a fox, or and you know, and half the people in the
I don't remember that chapter of Wind in the Willows.
And half the people in the replies are like, what the fuck is this? And the other half of the people are like, of course, yeah.
That's literally
That's
me.
me. Yes. They're like, me and who?
Wait, which one? Who's getting shat on in this situation?
I don't know. You need to.
I guess that's
them.
up to the listener.
Exact. We leave that as an exercise to the listener.
I mean, that's so interesting though, because so the juxtaposition between the sort of the alienness of the past, even the quite recent past, but also the things that are so recognizable about it. And what I think your account does so well is it makes the distant past feel emotionally and conceptually different. It makes it, what it really does really well is it makes you, it does sort of put you in a different frame of thinking about this, because it's so fucking weird. This is like well past like any avant-garde art that we have these days, where it's like, here's a fucking urinal in the Tate Modern.
Yep.
By the way, I want to be on the record for this. I like the Tate Modern urinal. I think it's good. And yeah, I am just, I think that as somebody who has sort of come at it from being a fan first, I think that that's what's captivating about this stuff. In addition to the fact they're often quite funny, and the captions are very funny as well.
Thank you. I think that what you say, you make a really good point with that. And I think that, you know, weirdness is kind of like the substrate upon which internet and internet culture grows. And so I think that to be online is to be deeply immersed in weirdness. But I think that, like, the weirdness we create when we're on the internet feels so 21st century and so modern. And I think to sort of see something weird from 700 years ago, it's kind of this, like, almost, it's hard to reconcile the two reactions you have of, oh, this is, like, you know, this is something I can relate to, but also, you know, I didn't know they had this type of, you know, culture. And not to say that, you know, everything that is shown on the account is just weird for the sake of it, the way things on the internet are. But I think that it's...
And we'll get into that.
We'll get into that later. But yeah, I think it's interesting kind of reconciling those two reactions and seeing how people kind of, navigate those two conflicting responses.
And I think that another thing that's really interesting about the account, and I think another reason why it's really compelling, is because it shows you a different side of medieval life that is because the media that we consume about the Middle Ages is by and large miserable, depressing, colorless, not very fun, to be honest, unless it's like an outright comedy or like a fantasy thing. Like, it's like one of the things that because I fucking hate Braveheart. It's one of my least favorite movies of all time.
Does this have anything to do with the fact that you're Scottish?
It has about 50% to do with the fact that I'm Scottish, and 40% to do with the fact that it's Mel Gibson, and 10% to do
Wow.
10% to do with the part that I'm getting to, which is that it's so boring to look at.
Yes.
It's like washed out, miserable, fucking, just like grimy men with beards sitting in a field stabbing each other.
Yeah, it's just people sitting around, like, waiting to die,
Yes!
I think, is, like, how people perceive the Middle Ages. And I think it's really interesting because in movies like Braveheart, yeah, I don't think people are, like, interested in letting the Middle Ages tell their own story.
No, because Braveheart in particular is really about the American War for Independence.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a metaphor.
Yeah, and of course all sort of interest that we have in history is going to be motivated by contemporary concerns, but people in the mainstream, I would say, and pop culture is really only interested in engaging with the Middle Ages in an attempt to sort of coerce out, like, modern narratives. I mean, even if you look at something like, Monty Python, which is kind of the other end of the spectrum, in that it's very goofy and very silly, and, it's not necessarily this dull, humorless world, but it is sort of this entirely modern world, and all of the humor comes from modern sensibilities.
Actually, it's crazy you should mention Monty Python, because the example that I always sort of think of when I think of the popular image of Monty Python, and I actually haven't seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail in years, so this might be a misremembering, but the thing that always sticks with me is the scene where it's that great scene where all the knights sort of come by these peasants, and King Arthur sort of tells them that he's the king, and they're like, well, I didn't vote for you. It's a great scene, but what I always think about is that it's just these, like, people in rags rummaging around in muck.
Yeah, exactly.
Doing nothing in particular.
Exactly.
They're just, like, muck foraging, basically.
Exactly.
And that is the image of the Middle Ages. And it's, I think that there's definitely another tendency that goes kind of the other way, which is the whole meme about, medieval peasants worked less than you, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
blah.
life is better, actually.
Yeah, which is terrible
It's its
as
own
well.
issue.
Yeah. But in terms of, like, the emotional and psychological world of the Middle Ages,
Yeah.
the Weird Medieval Guy's Twitter account, I would say, has, and I am maybe exaggerating a little bit, but I don't think I am. I'm not intentionally doing this. I think it has done a tremendous amount of good for showing another side of a period that's quite often sort of maligned
Yeah.
as boring. I certainly.
Oh.
I am a modernist. This is a admission of guilt, okay? I'm not a medieval historian. My interest in history usually starts around the 18th century. That's my wheelhouse, really. Like, give me the Greco-Turkish War of 1922 to 1923. Any
Okay.
day.
Yes. You can have it.
Oh, thank you. But I think that I was not interested in the Middle Ages because I had that same idea. That basically, it's just everybody's just waiting for the Renaissance to start.
Yeah.
Basically.
Exactly.
Everybody's sort of sitting around post-fall of Rome, and there are some interesting things happening in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Which are mostly either related to, like, classical thinking or the roots of Renaissance thinking.
Yeah.
Often, I think.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, I have a deep obsession with, like, Islamic and Ottoman history, so I'm probably a little bit biased in that.
Yeah, fair. But yeah, I think that was, because I'm also not a medieval historian. In fact,
I'm sorry, we're frauds.
I'm not a historian at all.
Oh, it all
our
comes
history
out.
podcast.
Welcome to our history podcast. It's just a woman with a Twitter account and a man who fucking hates the Middle Ages.
Exactly.
I'm so sorry.
And we're here to tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah, listen to me.
Yeah. No, but seriously, because I'm not a medievalist, and I didn't feel comfortable, sharing. I didn't feel comfortable telling people how to interpret these images, the images that I post. So I think it was almost unintentional in the beginning that I would just add a really short caption, and I wouldn't necessarily try to go into it too much. But I think because it became this thing of letting the images speak for themselves and almost giving, the people that made them their own voice almost, and letting the story come through purely because of the primary source, I think that was also kind of part of the success.
That brings us, I think, quite smoothly onto the question we want to explore in this episode, which is, why did they do this? What was going on, basically, in the medieval period that led to people doing this very specific form of art? Because that's what it is. It's a form of art that just doesn't exist anymore.
I think that's by far the question people ask the most often in their replies, is they get in their replies and why the fuck would anyone draw this? Like, why? What was going on in someone's mind when they put pen to paper and drew a cat licking its own butt next to a monkey? Or, what could possibly be going through someone's mind that they would draw, a woman in bed with a dragon and shit like that,
People still do that,
That's...
Go to deviantart.com.
What could possibly be going through someone's mind that they would, what could have been going through Rorschach's mind when he drew so many pictures of my dad hitting me?
So what's a weird medieval guy? Like, what is, as the person who invented this whole category, what is the definition that you use to sort of select for posting?
Yeah, so most of what I post is from manuscripts. So they're from books that were written in the Middle Ages, that were handwritten by scribes. So there was no printing press, of course. So they're illustrations from the insides of medieval manuscripts. So what makes them weird? Because actually, if you look at illustrations from medieval manuscripts, a lot of them are actually quite normal and don't necessarily raise any questions. There's a lot where you go through and it's like, oh, a flower, how nice. But I think that what makes something weird, what makes a medieval manuscript drawing weird to someone now, is either that it's a drawing of something they haven't seen before, so some kind of, creature or monster that they're not familiar with, or some kind of scene that they're not familiar with. They don't know what's going on, and you don't know how to interpret it. Or I think it can also be something that is a familiar subject, so, like a cat, a fox, a person, a guy, but it's drawn in a way that feels weird. It's not a sort of style of depiction you're used to. So I think one of the most common examples for something like that is, animals that have faces that look very human. You get like a cat, but it's got the face of like Michael Fassbender. And it's like, why? Because surely they knew what cats looked like back then.
Or baby Jesus,
or
who looks like a middle-aged deli shop owner.
Yeah, exactly. Why would they choose to draw them weird? Why wouldn't they just draw them normal? I think that's the question that a lot of people ask. I think in order to answer that question, it's maybe worth going through and looking at who was drawing these pictures in medieval manuscripts.
Because the popular conception is that it's monks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's kind of usually the layperson's interpretation of, oh, this was a monk doing this.
And they're kind of right.
They're kind of right.
To start with, if you go back to the period that sort of people used to call the Dark Ages, and you sort of look at the text from that period, generally speaking, it's being produced by people in religious institutions. So, monks, for the most part. And that kind of impacts the kind of stuff that they're writing about.
Exactly. So it's mostly religious texts that we see. I think if you look especially before the 11th century and the 12th century, what you get is this body of work that's mostly religious texts, like prayer books, for instance, are a big one.
They fucking love making saints' lives.
Yeah, they loved writing about saints.
And then Saint Cuthbert went and he saw a fox, and he cut the fox's head off, but then the fox's head grew back, and he was like, that's
Everyone
Jesus
was
right
like-
there. Saint Cuthbert didn't do that.
And he became the patron saint of fox decapitations or something.
There's a lot of that. It's very
Yeah.
tedious, heavy stuff.
Yeah, and so you have illustrations in them that are often sort of depicting the events that are taking place. And so often these are sort of very strange events. They're decapitations. I mean, you have, for instance, Saint Denis of Paris, who famously got decapitated and then walked around holding his own head.
It's like the legend of Sleepy Hollow.
Wow. And I think it's, at that point in time, a lot of art was, and especially manuscript art, was very heavily iconographic. And I think this is one of the biggest things people bring up and learn about when they're just kind of getting into medieval art, is that often, and especially in the beginning, the point of this art was actually to be very highly stylized. And it wasn't always to be anatomically accurate. I think that it's hard to kind of, say outright why this arose, and so I think that people often think like, oh, the ability to make like nice art was lost, or people, even worse actually, or people just lost the interest in making things that look nice.
Right, let's fucking deal with that right now, okay?
Yeah,
Because I am...
which is stupid. Which is stupid. Don't say that.
So the people who... when people make that argument, they're kind of missing the point about what a book is, essentially. And they're kind of missing the way in which it changed.
Yeah.
Whoever is making this stuff, whether it's monks in the earlier period or other people later down the line, it's an incredibly labor-intensive process.
Yeah, exactly.
The reason, and so books are phenomenally expensive.
Absolutely.
They have to be luxury items. You would own, a very wealthy person in the Middle Ages would, even if, assuming they were even literate, would only have a couple of books.
Yeah.
They, and the reason why they're so ornamented is because it's a fucking luxury item. It's like a ring that's got too many diamonds on it, or trying to think of another tell me what an expensive thing is.
It's like it's like one of those dogs that dies like a week after you get it from chronic bronchitis. It's just like something that's expensive for the sake of it. No,
Yeah.
I think that's maybe a bit unfair, but I think even in the early Middle Ages, when most of these manuscripts were made by monasteries and by monks, often the monastery needed like a patron who was a wealthy benefactor to come in and bankroll like a new Bible, because it was just not something that you could afford, because you need like 60 goat skins and you need ink
and you need
bindings.
labor time.
Yeah,
as well,
exactly.
Which, if you think about what a monastery in the Middle Ages is, it's actually obviously they have tithes and so on, but it is to some degree a subsistence community.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that actually goes in to being a monk.
Yeah.
And that's not even getting into the sort of the religious sort of rites that you have to practice, which are incredibly important to people at that point in history, and specifically to those people who have that kind of cloistered experience. So anyway, the point is, a book is not what we think of as a book now. It's this incredibly hard to produce, quite rare object, and so of course it is this sort of, if you're expending so much time and effort and money to produce it, you want to make it fucking nice. And what the printing press does in the early modern period, hundreds of years later, is that it makes books far, far, far easier to make, but it's more limited in what it can do.
Yep.
You can only really have, the reason why we don't really have illustrations in most sort of long books anymore is because it's really fucking expensive to use more than one kind of ink in a printing process. Whereas you don't, whilst there are all kinds of other constraints on book production in the medieval period, that kind of isn't one of them.
Yeah.
You can't produce it at scale.
Yeah.
But you don't need to.
Yeah. Exactly.
So shut up
yeah.
about things not being nice anymore.
Yeah.
Please.
So these were, hugely expensive books that people put a lot of effort into making. And I think this also kind of brings us to another myth that I kind of like to address.
Yes.
Which is something that people seem to repeat often, which is that these drawings in the margins of medieval manuscripts, or anywhere in medieval manuscripts, were made because the people making the manuscripts were bored. So this is something that comes up all the time, is people saying, oh, these monks sure must have been bored to draw this funny little drawing in a manuscript. So this is a huge, massive misconception. I don't necessarily know where it comes from. I think part of where it comes from, well, I think first of all, let's address why that's wrong. So as you just said, these are insanely expensive books. They take ages to make.
Forever.
It's a hugely important undertaking, and you're not just going to kind of stop halfway through writing most of the time and start doodling in the margins.
It's
often.
not boring.
Yeah.
It's really hard, and you have to think about it quite a lot.
Exactly. It might have been, I think a bit boring writing
Anyone
sometimes.
who's ever had to, write the minutes of a meeting
exactly.
at work, that's, exponentially less hard than trying to copy exactly what's said on a page onto another page.
Yeah, exactly. So to an extent, this was your job, is, writing however many hours a day there were daylight, and then maybe a bit longer if you had, candles, if you had the budget for that in your monastery. But most of the drawings that we see were not necessarily doodles that were made by their creators. Another thing that's sort of important to address about this is often people say this about things that are fully sort of colored in and painted. And what you saw with most of these manuscripts, the way they were made, was you would draw in space for illustrations, and one guy would do the writing, or at least one guy would do the writing, and then you would have a whole different person or team of people to do the illustrations.
Oh, shit.
So people, I think, have this idea that, I don't think it's a very well thought through idea that a lot of these full color illustrations are the product of boredom, because you're not going to put down your quill, get out your paintbrushes and your pigment powders that you need to mix and turn all by yourself into pigments, and just sort of whack out a little full color illustration just because you're bored.
It's like looking at a comic book and saying, wow, somebody must have been really bored to put all this writing in there.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think that's something that, it didn't really happen. And I think sometimes you do get very small little marginal drawings, and often you can tell that these are not intentional illustrations because they are just in, black or brown ink, and they look quite sort of scratched in and a little bit crude. But I think maybe part of the reason why this myth started is because there actually are examples, I would say more examples, of people who were scribes writing down little notes or sort of little asides as they wrote their manuscript, or as they transcribed the manuscript.
Oh, yes. And you have some of those with you.
And I have some of those with me. So you might, for instance, start the manuscript, with an inscription about the scribe saying, who you were and when you wrote it. Or you might end it by saying, this thus finishes this manuscript by, Gregorius Ivanus, 1202 AD, amen, or whatever. But often you would end up with people sort of putting down their little thoughts as you were writing. You'd scribble something down in the margins. So there's one, for example, from a manuscript where someone, having gotten to the very end of their writing, wrote, "As the harbor is welcome to the sailor, so is the last line to the scribe." And so you get a lot of sort
it's
of
quite poetic,
nice little poetic lines like that, and you do actually get quite a few sort of goofy ones where it's okay, this is a bit less serious. So we have another one at the end of a manuscript where it says, "Now I've written the whole thing. for Christ's sake, give me a drink, which is great. We have one from someone who was clearly copying down another manuscript because they wrote, whoever translated these Gospels did a very poor job in the margins.
Oh, can I do one?
Yes, please.
So we have, cursed be the pesky cat that urinated all over this book during the night in Deventer, and because of it many other cats too. And beware well not to leave open books at night, where cats can come.
Oh, you've really stolen the show. I haven't been doing voices.
You're missing out.
Yeah, so you do have a tradition of these kind of little written asides, but most illustrations can't be said to fall into that category.
Mm-hmm.
So you do have these sort of religious books that were, made in the beginning.
But it's not, this is another interesting thing I think it's worth noting, is that when we say religious, it's not just like books about Jesus or books about or copying the Gospels or prayer books or whatever. You also do have some stuff that is not explicitly religious, and in fact is kind of drawing on pre-Christian pagan culture. My favorite example is from Ireland, because in Ireland you have this vast body of essentially pagan storytelling, like this epic literature full of like gods and fucking bulls the size of houses, and people are always doing great feats of strength, and it's this tremendous like body of work that has sort of been preserved really, really well, but preserved really, really well in the first instance by monks. Like, the reason why we have all this stuff is because Christians took great care to copy the stuff down, and that's not to say that they weren't Christian, or that they were like holding on to the sort of pre-Christian mythology in a literal sense, but people were still interested in and wanted to read about like these fantastical stories, even if they didn't think they were literally true.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really good point, and a lot of medieval texts, especially ones that aren't prayer books or gospels, are adapted directly from pre-Christian sources. So a really big one that was quite popular in the early and the high Middle Ages was the Bestiary. And so the Bestiary was often adapted from Isidore of Seville, who was a Christian but who compiled a lot of works by classical writers like Aristotle. And the Bestiary is this like animal compendium guide, and it has entries for all these different animals that you see.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If somebody worked on transcribing and copying the Bestiary, would it be fair to then call them a Beastie Boy?
I think so, yeah. A little monster, maybe. So your Beastie Boys are in their, they're called scriptoriums, where all the monks sit writing down their manuscripts. And these would often, and so they have these stories in them about animals, and so you often start with like the lion, because that's the most important animal, and you have a little story talking about the lion, but it's not a scientific work, and it's not meant to convey like information for people who study animals. It's actually more like a little book of parables, so it will tell little stories about the lion. So something that, for instance, comes up a lot in bestiaries is that lions are born dead, and after 3 days their father roars over them and they're brought back to life, the little lion cubs.
Why didn't David Attenborough tell me any of this?
I know. And so, these are, or you have, for instance, that, a lion won't attack someone who bows before him. And so you have this really obvious narrative that's put into there about lions being noble and good because they're associated with Christ. And in many ways, the lion is sort of Christ, quite literally. And this isn't something that people necessarily believe lions actually do, although there aren't really, a lot of lions kicking about in Northern Europe at this time, so you didn't really have to, confront the realities of, lion reproduction. But it's not the point is not like that it's supposed to be true. The point is that it tells like a very compelling story, and it motivates you to be a better Christian and thus a better person. So you're supposed to align yourself with the lion, and so you have other animals as well. Dragons, you have, for instance, that they're very evil and, are often sort of compared with the devil. And because these animals are these allegories for very human experiences of either virtue or sin and very human traits, you often get these illustrations of them that humanize them. And so you get lions with very human faces, or you get these drawings that aren't necessarily anatomically accurate to what these animals looked like, because they're not supposed to be showing them as, how they actually look. They're representing them as part of this Christian tradition of storytelling. And so even though, some of them do look kind of like broken, like
goofy,
just fucked up. Even though some of the animals do look like they've been dropped down a flight of stairs.
They look like that bad taxidermy Reddit page.
Yeah, exactly. The point is that they're representative of almost like an alternative Christianified version of this animal. And so that's why you get like snakes that almost look like dogs, and things like that, is because it's part of its own separate artistic tradition. And for a lot of drawings of animals, I think that's quite a big part of it, and it's part of why there wasn't an emphasis on anatomical accuracy. Something that I compare it a lot to in my mind, that I think makes sense as a comparison, is like, animals in like comic books. Like when you have Garfield the cat, you could look at Garfield the cat and say, okay, yeah, he looks fucked up. Like, surely Jim Davis knows what
Jim Davis has seen a cat.
Surely Jim Davis has seen a cat before, right? So why did he make Garfield look so bad? But then, obviously you have to step outside of that and say, okay, Garfield is, he's, in many ways, he's also a human. He represents a kind of, little slice of humanity. All of us have.
You look at Garfield and you go, wow, he's just like me.
He's just like me.
I also like to
Yeah.
put a whole chicken in my mouth.
Yeah.
And then pull out a complete skeleton.
And surely, ostensibly, Jim Davis knew that cats don't do that
Yeah.
in real life. But he chose to tell a story about a cat doing that to, for people to relate to and for people
So what
to
you're
learn
saying, kind of, is that this stuff, the reason they look fucked up and weird is because it's kind of a mix of Garfield plus Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories.
Yes, exact, spot on.
So it's a sort of, it's a visual, it's a visualization of the metaphor.
So we can't sort of try to explain, this really should have gone at like the beginning of this bit.
Oh,
We
well.
can't really try to explain why every single piece of medieval art that's weird is weird, but we can try to give a few examples of different sort of artistic and cultural trends that led specific pieces of art or art from specific manuscripts to feel weird to a modern viewer.
And this is, I think, leads us really nicely onto a wider point that I think it's quite important to get over about what actually it means to process information in a world, and the way that you engage with the world in a society where like writing is not the main way that that's done. Like, we have this image of everybody in the Middle Ages is literate except for monks. That's not true. It's probably more accurate to say that there was levels of literacy that varied across the population. But it's fair enough to say that people's level of engagement with the written word was not what we have now. And that, I think, is a really, really significant point that gets kind of missed a lot of the time when we try and think our way back to the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
So there's a book that I quite like. I think it goes a little bit too far in some places, but that I quite like, called Amusing Ourselves to Death. That is basically a kind of it's really making an argument about television and how television is going to change politics and culture. And it was written in the I think the late 80s. It's kind of, or maybe 90s. Basically, it makes the argument that what the expansion of mass literacy and then the expansion of the written word through the printing press at more or less the same time did was it changed the way that our brains worked. It meant that we were thinking about things in an abstract way. And I don't necessarily agree with that book, because I think that what we can take from that example that you just gave about Garfield is that these like non-literal depictions, the prevalence of non-literal depictions of animals and people and disembodied penises or whatever, it's a different way of getting people to think laterally or in an abstract way. So it's a way of sort of wiring your brain in a certain way when you would be used to processing information visually. The great example of like how people process things in a visual way that I always like is that the reason why all the pubs in the UK all have this super like visual names, like I don't know, the dog and the pear tree or whatever, is because people would not be, when people were going to the pub and trying to find their way to it, they would not be looking on Google Maps for things as the dog and the pear tree. They'd be looking for a sign that had a dog and a pear tree on. And so what we need to do when we are sort of thinking about this kind of art is thinking about the fact that people are receiving and processing information in a very different way than what we did in the sort of era where the written word was king, and even now when we have like video and podcasts.
Wow. Aren't we lucky? Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And you see in a lot of medieval manuscripts as well, especially as you got more into prayer books that were made for individual people. So as over the course of the Middle Ages, gradually it became more common for people who are very wealthy to want their own medieval manuscripts and their own books. You also see that you have illustrations in the margins that are made to emphasize the morals of the stories that they're telling, of the prayers that are made to sort of help you connect with the text, make the text maybe more memorable, make it more beautiful, you know, maybe indicate a really interesting or important part of the text. And often these can also be sort of really, really funny drawings, and often the people that drew them would kind of take an opportunity to add in a little bit of wit or a little bit of humor. So there are sort of different theories about maybe, for instance, the people who were artists, who were different to the scribes, maybe they were taking an opportunity to sort of, push back on the religious texts by making, a little sort of silly parody or something out of them. But you do have really interesting little images in some manuscripts that are almost, or are puns on the words in the text. So a really good example is in a manuscript called the Rutland Psalter, that's held in the British Library. And this is a really classic one where every single page has on it some sort of, really weird, like hybrid character, a guy with goat legs, or a woman with, fish, with a fish for a head or something. And at first glance, it is one of those things where you look at it and think, wow, someone must have either been bored smoking crack or, I don't know.
Drinking too much beer.
Or drinking too much beer, exactly.
Which is another, by the way.
Yes.
Since we're busting myths as we go, I just like to put this out there into the universe. There's this idea that everybody in the Middle Ages was pissed all the time because, the water was too dirty to drink, because you're full of diseases, and so they all drank beer. And that is kind of true. It depends on where you're talking about. But the important point that gets missed is that beer in the Middle Ages is not what we consider as beer now. It's made in the same process, but it's much, much, much weaker.
Yes.
So it's like 1%.
Yes.
You would not get fucked up on that.
Yes. And also people did have access to clean water back then.
Yes.
They had plumbing. They had rivers. They had rain. You could, collect rain. Mm-hmm. So you see a lot of these, goofy images in this manuscript. And there's this one of these two guys, and they both have, like, monster legs, and they're fighting. And one of them has the other guy by the ear, and it looks like he's trying to rip off his ear or something. And it's kind of a classic, silly illustration. But in the text on that page, there is a psalm or a prayer that begins with, lend me your ear. So it's
Come on,
telling you,
give it.
yeah,
Fucking give it to me.
exactly, and it's a pun. It's a very direct pun on the text.
And I think that there's another important piece of context for this, which is that not only are these books super labor intensive to make, but also because there's so few of them, it's something that you're going to read over and over and over again.
Yeah.
You need more entertainment value.
Yeah, exactly.
Like if I'm going to read fucking Hilary Mantel's masterpiece, Wolf Hall, I'm probably not going to read it like over and over and over again, unless I really, really, really want to. I can do other stuff. I can watch Toast of London if I want to. Like I can. You
can go outside. You can listen to a podcast.
I can listen to a podcast. I can go on TikTok. I mean, I don't, but I could if I wanted to.
And these were things that they didn't have in the Middle Ages, unfortunately.
You heard this here first, folks.
One of the unfortunate realities.
They didn't have podcasts.
They didn't have podcasts.
But yeah, so it's meant to. People kind of asked a bit more of books back then.
Exactly.
Like you would appreciate it if you could sort of, in the midst of this unbearably dull sort of narrative about like I said, a decapitated fox, there was like a little bit of fun.
Exactly. And I think especially as we move sort of, to the later part of the Middle Ages, what sort of happened was that there became this growing demand for manuscripts among rich people who just wanted them for their own private study, but also because it was this huge symbol of wealth and status, and you could, impress your friends and your neighbors by having a book, or if they had a book, you could have two books, and it was, it was like its own sort of rat race, and so it also became a symbol of wealth to have a book that was really beautifully illustrated and really beautifully decorated on the inside, and so you would have these books that have, illustrations of the actual scenes in them, so the biblical scenes or the prayer scenes, but then often around the edges, in the margins, you would get this decorative border that would have perhaps animals or plants or patterns, but also these sort of fantastical creatures, hybrid creatures that are often referred to as drolleries or grotesques, that are also there to interest you and to make the book really captivating and to show that it's, a beautiful piece of art that was made for you.
I think that it's good that you bring up change, because one of the things that we haven't really acknowledged yet, and any historians who've made it this far will be like desperately bashing their head against the wall because we haven't talked about the fact that from about the, what do you say, like 11th century onwards, it's not monks that are making this.
Exactly.
It is, these are dedicated workshops that are in, towns and major cities where people whose job it is just to do this are making this stuff. And there's a general sort of change in what kind of books are being produced.
So in the early Middle Ages, up to the 11th or 12th century, you have these manuscripts that are basically only made by monks. And if you wanted a manuscript for yourself, gotta ask a monk for it. And
excuse me, Mr. Monk.
Please, sir, may I have a prayer book?
No. I need to grow potatoes and torment these peasants who live on my land.
Exactly. And so then over the sort of 12th century, or by the 12th century, what we see is a transition where these independent workshops that are, just employing people who are not clergy, whose job is just scribe, or whose job is illuminator. Those are the people that make the illustrations or illuminations in the manuscripts. And all of a sudden now, actually, if you are a monastery or a church and you want a manuscript, now you're actually contracting out that work to these external workshops. And a big part of this was to fulfill a demand among the upper class for books, for manuscripts, for prayer books, for things that were fancy and things that were beautiful and things that you as an individual could own, provided that you had the money. And so what that also led to was a diversification in some ways of the types of texts that were written down and that were produced, and the types of manuscripts that we see later on in the Middle Ages.
So, teacher, what kind of manuscripts do we see in the later Middle Ages?
So, we've gone through a few different types that were from earlier on in the Middle Ages, like bestiaries and books about saints' lives and prayer books in particular are still being produced. In fact, they're one of the main types of books that are produced, and by far the most popular type of prayer book by the late Middle Ages is the Book of Hours. So this is a prayer book with prayers that you say at different times of the day, hence Book of Hours. And so you get this really beautiful artistic tradition dedicated to illustrating these books, where because they're not necessarily telling stories, you don't always have illustrations of the content per se, but you often have illustrations of biblical scenes. You might have illustrations of things that were personal to the person who commissioned the book, so you might have a little drawing of him or her praying and their patron saints and little sort of personal homages, and you also often have a continuation of this tradition of making, little decorative hybrid creatures, and so you get a lot of those throughout the margins and different scenes of those. So you get sort of history books as well, for instance, so there's an increasing interest in, for instance, classical history, so you get all sorts of books about Julius Caesar. You get books that are translated writings directly from the Latin that are, writings by, Caligula and writings by Caesar, and so there had always been an interest in classical authors, so you had a lot of works even earlier in the Middle Ages that were based off of Aristotle, or works by Aristotle and by Greek and Latin writers. But often these were very specifically sort of medicinal or herbal or scientific texts, and so later in the Middle Ages you see much more of an interest in the sort of human stories and in the actual histories. So that's
which is sort of a in contrast to a way that I think a lot of people think about the medieval relationship with the classical past, in that I think a lot of people on some level understand it as this kind of there was this great loss of knowledge about the Middle Ages, and we can talk some other time about where that idea comes from. And there's definitely stuff that is sort of lost, and it at least lost to Western Europe, and sort of gets preserved only really in the Byzantine Empire and by some of the Arab scholars. But generally speaking, there is a relative continuity and a continuing access to these classical texts.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most popular tweets that I've made on the account is this picture of this woman in bed with a dragon, and she's a queen, she's wearing a crown, and there's a king, presumably her husband, looking through the door.
And he says, "My wife!"
And this is actually a drawing from a medieval history of Alexander the Great, and it's about one of the legends about Alexander the Great, which is that his dad was a warlock who transformed himself into a dragon to cuck Alexander the Great's mom's husband. And so, a lot of the weirdness in some of those drawings can actually be attributed to the Greeks and the Romans, who a lot of people don't realize but were as weird in many ways as the medieval medieval people.
Anybody who's not a classicist, guys, just Zeus and the Swan.
Yeah,
that's all I'll say.
Absolutely.
So we've got we've got these we've got history books, we've got sort of more explicitly religious books.
Yeah, we have more literature as well. I think that's really important. There's more literature, and especially vernacular literature. So all of a sudden we have people like Chaucer and Boccaccio who are writing not in Latin anymore. So before this, basically every single book was written in Latin. Prayers were in Latin, medicinal books were in Latin, all of education was in Latin, and even though this emphasis on Latin, still continued for a really long time and was still really big even in the end of the Middle Ages, you also see more people writing their own original stories in their native vernacular languages like English and French and German and all the other languages you've got.
No, go and list all the languages.
Latin, Hungarian, Swabian, Flemish, that's it.
All the languages.
That's all the languages.
You hear that?
They didn't have that many
Eastern
languages.
Europeans?
Yeah, sorry.
You don't exist.
Sorry that you guys didn't exist yet.
And you also have this emerging genre, which I am endlessly interested in, of travel logs.
Yes.
So the medieval people are just fascinated by stuff that's going on outside of their immediate sort of world, and there is endless speculation. Because the thing, again, another thing to remember about the Middle Ages is that, yes, it's true that the sort of popular idea of everybody is just a farmer and their ancestors just lived on that one farm for 1,000 years. Like, that's an overcorrection. There definitely was travel and trade. Like, how the fuck did Italians end up on the other, on like the Black Sea? And
I don't want to know.
like there is huge, particularly in the late Middle Ages, there's huge amounts of trade happening in the Mediterranean region. Contrary to some people's sort of ideas about the relationship between Europe and Africa and the Middle East. Anyway, but it still is true that travel in the Middle Ages was really, really hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you got to think about what are the things, not just like technological things that are different from now, but the general politics of the Middle Ages. So one of the things the reason why we were able to travel is, yes, we have planes and high-speed rail and the automobile, etc., 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 but we also can count on, for the most part, stable, defined borders, the rule of law, for the most part. All this stuff facilitates international travel. If you are traveling in, like, let's say Eastern Europe in the sort of early to high Middle Ages, it's a mess, right? These questions about sovereignty and who is the boss and who you need to pay to get to places, and like in law enforcement, all of this stuff is kind of up in the air. We don't have a modern state yet.
Yeah.
And the modern state is what allows massive numbers of people to travel as freely as they do.
Absolutely. So some of the sort of most frequent types of travel that people would do in the Middle Ages, you had pilgrimages, so people would go to a shrine or a holy site, but most often this would be somewhere nearby. Or if you were a student, you could travel to study if there was a scholar that you wanted to study with. If you wanted to study medicine or law or theology or similar, you could go to Paris or Bologna.
Or mercenaries.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a huge, again, we're talking about the modern state, like a lot of countries did not have standing armies at this stage, so a lot of war is carried out by mercenaries, people who end up traveling all around Europe, fighting in Italy, or really hundreds and hundreds of miles away from where they were born, or people are abducted by pirates. That's a classic one.
A classic one.
It shows up
all the time.
It shows up in a lot of saints' lives.
Yeah. It was definitely something people thought about.
People got around, but anyway.
But I think the point that I'm trying to make here. I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that even though travel happened, it was often in these very well sort of defined journeys, or these very well defined routes, where it was really only feasible to go somewhere if you knew exactly where you were going, what to expect, and what you would be doing when you were there, and of course that you had the means to get there and to sustain yourself for the journey there, at your destination, and on the way back. So that obviously made it a lot more difficult to just say, oh, I want to go to Amsterdam on a lad's holiday. No, you can't do that. You can't do that.
But people are still curious about the outside world, and so you get this explosion of writing about. I mean, people are particularly interested in the Holy Land because it has this sort of, especially after the rise of Islam in what we now call the Middle East. It's harder to get there, and so people are endlessly sort of fascinated by what's going on there. They're fucking guys with ears the size of a house or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So you had this
bear men.
You had stories that were brought back by people who did travel, to the what we now call the Middle East for trade,
or
to Africa, or to even further in Asia. But the dissemination of these people's stories was obviously, very difficult because, as we've discussed, the population was not of Europe in general was not hugely literate, and because there was no printing, it was hard to disseminate written accounts. And so you had these people that came back telling stories, but by the time this story got to you as, a farmer in, rural Germany or Poland, you weren't really getting, the direct story as it was told.
Try and imagine pitching to a medieval peasant what a rhinoceros is.
Exactly, yeah.
It's like, it's a fucking horse that's, shaped like a pig, and it's,
it's got armor.
Huge. It wears armor, and it's got spikes on its head. You'd lose your shit.
Yeah, exactly. And, they had sort of menageries, so you might have seen, a monkey if you lived in medieval England, maybe, but you're not getting a rhinoceros.
And they had descriptions as well from the classical.
They had descriptions, but you're not getting a rhinoceros back to London without a fight, So you wouldn't, and imagining, it's so easy now to pull up a picture of a rhinoceros, and Google rhinoceros facts and to separate the truth.
That's
from
one of my
fiction.
favorite activities. How did you know that?
I live under your bed.
Whoa.
I'm
gonna go.
but nowadays that's easy. So we see a lot of drawings, as you said, of, accounts from distant lands that are accompanied by drawings of, and I saw these guys. A guy with ears the size of, his body. A guy
ants
with
the size of camels.
Ants the size of camels.
That's a big one.
That's a big
Dragons,
one. Dragons,
obviously.
Of course, unicorns, phoenixes.
Yeah.
Dudes with dog heads, guys with no heads who had faces on their chests, guys who had one giant foot that they hopped around on. And it sounds goofy to us now, obviously.
But people believed it. You have accounts of people once sort of travel to Asia starts to open up a little bit in the late medieval, early modern period. You have accounts of these people who keep on going to these poor Central Asian Kazakh villages and being so where are the dog people at? And just oh, it's over the next hill. No, yeah, just fuck off.
Oh god. Yeah, and I think that, these stories were really compelling to people because they're really interesting. It wasn't just that people thought there was the hard evidence to back this up, but also it's so easy to imagine if you heard a story about a guy with no head and a face on his chest, or a dragon.
You'd be like, damn, that's fucked up.
Yeah, isn't there a story about, why peppercorns are black or something that has to do with a dragon?
Oh my god. So the reason why peppercorns are black, according to one of my favorite sources, which is a manuscript called The Wonders of the East. Yeah, so pepper is black because you have to steal it from snakes by burning the ground to basically get rid of them.
Yeah, because isn't the idea that the snakes, guard the pepper tree?
Yes.
They're no pepper for you.
This is my pepper. I'm a snake. I'm very invested in this for some reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's so there's the way that you get gold. This is from the same manuscript. The way that you get gold is there are ants that are the size of horses, and they'll dig up gold for you, but you have to steal the gold from them. And the only way you can steal it from them is by distracting them by giving them camels.
Of course.
The ants are just
Classic.
this is fucking crazy. Look at this.
Wow.
Look at this thing. It's got two humps
anymore.
I'm a giant ant, and I think this is mad.
None of the boys are interested in gold anymore. We're into camels now.
Yeah.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah, it's a lot of that.
Yeah, and they're interesting stories, and I think they reflect this fascination that people have and have always had with the worlds, beyond what's known. And I think it ties maybe into sort of a wider, particularly medieval tendency to be really interested in the unknown and especially the inhuman and the not quite human. And I think that this has been tied in by a lot of scholars with the tendency to draw all of these funny little hybrid, monster guys in manuscripts, is that the medieval world was this world of order where everything was created by God for a purpose. You had people who were, created in God's image and were just like God. And then you had the animal and the natural world, which was created by God to serve a purpose for humans. And so things that didn't quite fit into what was God's idea of creation or God's image for all of creation So things that were, hybrids, that weren't quite one thing or the other, that couldn't be categorized. I think that was really, really fascinating to the medieval mind.
And I think that there's a it's not quite the same, because people did, depending on the person, but to a degree, did sort of believe that this stuff was literally true in some cases. But I think that you can draw a line to sort of, it fills the same, or some of the same things that sort of speculative fiction does for us today. There is, I think, a continuity of being sort of fascinated by things that are strange or foreign or different.
Yeah.
In many ways, it's the kind of the same thing that you're doing when you go and look at weird medieval guys. It's fascinating to us now for kind of the same reason why it was fascinating to the people who made it.
Yeah, and I think in many ways...
Not exactly the same way, but...
Absolutely. No, I think in many ways, in the same way that, like, we as 21st century people often look at medieval art and say, wow, that's so weird, it's not right, it must reflect ignorance, or something that was, wrong or worse about these people. In the Middle Ages, something that was, hybrid or not quite human could reflect something that was bad, something that was not the way God wanted it, and therefore evil. And this often also spilled over into the real world, insofar as this was often how people who were disabled or people who didn't look like other people were categorized, people who, had some sort of visible illness. And so it was, this interest in the non-human and the not quite human and the strange was kind of a way of reinforcing Christian values in a Christian world narrative, and sort of affirming one's own place as, being right and what God wanted and what God intended.
Fuck. I didn't see that. That was really good. I did not
it's really
see that
interesting.
coming. Oh, I think you kind of bowled me over there a little bit.
And something, to take it a bit further, a lot of these little, figures that you get in the margins of medieval manuscripts, they're referred to as marginalia because they occupy the edges of the page rather than the center. So the center of the page was often where you would have a big religious illustration, and then you might have text around that, or you might have a full page illustration, and then in the margins is where you would get the hybrid and the grotesque and the not quite human, and that was almost sort of a counterpoint to the religious image in the center. And so it was these two kind of conflicting worlds, and in some ways it's been interpreted as like a reminder of, what lies within the known world and the good worlds and what lies beyond that. And it's, it's been described as a literal marginalization of the inhuman and of the not quite human, because these figures were relegated to the edges of the narrative and the edges of the physical and the ideological space.
And that definitely, I think, can in part, that way of communicating those kinds of ideas is, I think, in some ways part and parcel with a society that communicates information primarily visually.
Yeah.
Like, that's not the kind of way that we think now, because we don't necessarily have to structure things and structure information in that way. It's so interesting. I think that to turn the question of why is medieval art weird on its head, and I think ask the more interesting question, why do we find it weird? I think that you referred to Garfield earlier. I'm going to make an even more arcane reference. We, in the modern world, kind of come at this like the aliens from Galaxy Quest. Have you seen Galaxy Quest?
I haven't actually, no.
It's a phenomenal movie.
Okay.
But the entire premise of the film is that the actors from a show that's definitely not Star Trek get abducted by this race of aliens who don't have the capacity to process fiction.
Oh.
I think they're called the Thermians or whatever. And so they have received the broadcasts of this definitely not Star Trek show. I mean, like, this is historical texts. These are great heroes of Earth. And so they're like, we need you to fight our civilization is in peril, and we need you to save. See, you want to see the movie now. It's a great idea for a film. It's really funny. Here's a recommendation for you. Go watch Galaxy Quest. But anyway, so we have come at this from the position of the Thermians, in this case, of just like not really processing the information in the same way as the people who made it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is why it's weird. Yeah. We're kind of weird because we don't... I mean, we ultimately kind of can't... We can imagine what it would be like to be a medieval person, but we can't ultimately think our way into it.
Yes.
We've been trying to do that for quite a long time right now in this recording studio. And we're still kind of just guesstimating.
Yeah.
It's a good guess, but it's still to some level inaccessible.
Because ultimately, you know, we can't answer the blanket question of why was this weird or why do we think it's weird, because it was a whole era of different thought and of different sort of, you know, scholarly and cultural traditions. So we're able to pull out different examples of texts and try to explain why people made these texts and why people drew things on them the way that they did. But ultimately, we can't come up with a neat single sentence or even single podcast episode, unfortunately, explanation for...
I guess you're going to have to listen to the rest of the show.
For how this disconnect...
Very well done.
arose in 500 or more years of human history. Especially because if you think about it, someone in the year 1450 probably looked at the writings and drawings of people from the year 950 and thought, God, what the fuck were they doing?
What a bunch of fucking weirdos.
What a bunch of morons.
Why are they going on about this fucking fox that got its head chopped off?
They're not interested in Caesar. What a small, stupid, dark, dull world it must have been. And then we come along 500 years later and say, actually, that's you guys. And, you know, thus the pendulum swings in the other direction.
And guess what? It's going to happen to us, too. In the distant future of 2050... 2523. There we go.
Someone's going to be digging through the rubble of today's society. They're going to find an old laptop and power it on and see gigabytes of furry porn.
Who is this Garfield you speak of?
They're going to find all of my Garfield porn. And they're gonna say, that's really weird. And they'll be more justified than we are in calling the medieval world weird.
Well, on that utterly unspeakable mental image, I think that's just gonna do us for this first episode of the Weird Medieval Guys podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
I'm certainly happy to leave it there.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything else that I want you to say. Yeah, no, this has been a real pleasure to record, and yeah, if you've enjoyed this episode, then please follow Weird Medieval Guys and follow us.
On Twitter, I am at Olivia __MS.
And I am at Aran, ARAN, P Tappers. Until next time, in that case,